Ladies, gentlemen, children of most ages, welcome to this Thoughts on Film podcast. We are contraindicated for children ages 7 to 8. My name is Scott Morris, and I will be your genial host for this episode, and I am joined by the equally genial Craig Eastman.
I only stole a loaf of bread.
And the frankly more genial than either of us, Drew Tavendale. We thought we would change things up a little bit after a year of our podcast. If you've been with us for that year or even part of that, then thank you very much for your attention, and we hope that we've been worthy of it. You may be expecting to hear a commentary track in this particular slot. We've decided on reflection the main podcast feed doesn't seem quite the right place for movie commentaries to appear, and it certainly doesn't kind of tie in with the way that we listen to podcasts, for example. So I'm sure we will do some more down the line, but for at least a while we are going to spend the 10th of each month comparing and contrasting two films that have similar subjects, premises or themes, but take either different approaches or perhaps are just of wildly different quality. So, this month we are going to take a look at some political satire, as current Brexit-based events are so resplendently ludicrous that we now seem to have moved entirely beyond satire, rendering it completely redundant.
Coupled with today, the date at which we're recording this, at least today's publishing of the Chilcot Inquiry, which has quite a lot to say about media spin, I would imagine.
Indeed, the much delayed Chilcot report into the UK's role in the Iraq War rears its head this very day, so we thought we would take a look at both an American and a British take on manipulating a war for political gains. We'll be talking today about 1997's Wag the Dog and 2009's In the Loop. But I think we might just kick things off by giving you a brief rundown on the premises of both these films in case you haven't seen them. Craig, perhaps you'd like to give us a bit of a rundown on Wag the Dog?
Yes, if that's all right with you. So Wag the Dog, 1997, directed by Barry Levinson. Barry Levinson being a director with a fairly potted history of quality. For every Good Morning Vietnam, Rain Man and Sleepers, there is a Toys, Bandits and Sphere. The latter debacle being of cursory interest to us here tonight because it was during a break in filming that Levinson and star Dustin Hoffman disappeared off for 28 days to cobble together Wag the Dog. That being a film whose budget and final quality are absolutely inverse to that particular title. Wag the Dog centres around a US presidential campaign in which the incumbent's ambition for a second term seems irreparably compromised by a sex scandal about to hit the headlines. The president's advisors call in Robert De Niro's Stanley Breen, a hotshot media spin doctor whose skills at press manipulation seem their only hope at salvaging 4 more years. Breen's masterstroke is a plan to divert attention from the inevitably breaking scandal by absolutely, positively not suggesting to the press that the new B-3 stealth bomber will be dispatched ahead of completion of trials to intervene in an escalating crisis with the Albanians, who absolutely positively do not claim to have a nuclear suitcase bomb in Canada, which they plan to bring across the border and detonate on US soil. The fact that neither the B-3 bomber nor the suitcase bomb have any basis in reality hardly seems the point. And in enacting his plan, Breen enlists top Hollywood producer Stanley Motz, played by Hoffman, to produce the necessary materials to convince both the media and the public that the fantasy is in fact a reality. A movie of considerable quality, I have to say. I very much enjoyed Wag the Dog. Our current political circumstance in this country and elsewhere aside, even overlooking how prescient this movie seemed when it came out 19 years ago. It's a wonderful piece. Remarkable to think it was cobbled together in pretty much 28 days. And yes, I don't know, would either of you like to say anything of note?
I mean, surely the premier mark that this is a quality film is that you can put Dennis Leary in it and it doesn't ruin it.
Yes, he doesn't scuttle it.
Yes. But no, likewise, I tremendously enjoyed this. Hadn't really seen it at all until we broached it. It's been on my to-watch list for a while, but
just scandalously, same here.
Some tremendous performances. I don't know if I've seen Dustin Hoffman better, and certainly in the kind of more comedic side of things. Powerhouse performance, and Bob De Niro shows off his comic chops again when he's just reminds us that, of course, he can be very funny when he chooses to be in films that are funny rather than things that claim to be comedies.
It's almost
very much aren't.
Depressing, the disparity in quality between De Niro's performance here and something so ostensibly trivial a movie. Well, not trivial in terms of the topics it deals with, but in terms of sort of budgetary and production requirements compared to some of the pap that he's been associated with in recent years. And it wasn't that long ago that he was producing stuff of this quality. Why, Bobby? Why have you given up on us?
I mean, there's the occasional thing. It never was a fantastic film, but you'd get occasional glimpses of his acting chops again, something like City by the Sea, and maybe there was something interested him a bit. But it's almost like within a couple of years of this film, he just more or less decided to stop bothering. De Niro on this is almost... He just feels so at ease and relaxed.
Yeah.
And it works so well for the character, but it's
kind of, his performance kind of just slides off him in this, right? But not in a I'm here to pick up my paycheck way, just in a kind of that I'm making this look effortless, but I'm probably actually working very hard at it.
Yeah, I think it must be something to do with, I don't know, just the role appealing to him or something he could get his teeth into, because it's just, in this film, it's that way of professionals generally are really good at their job, make difficult things look easy. And he manages in this, and to say, since 1997, we've seen it precious few times. Yeah,
and I mean, it probably doesn't hurt that he's bouncing off of Dustin Hoffman here, which, as you point out, Scott, given arguably one of his, well, certainly I would agree with you, one of the best performances of his that I've seen. Dustin Hoffman's quality hasn't perhaps been as variable as De Niro's in recent years. I mean, the guy's got an outstanding back catalogue of phenomenal performances, not least in Rain Man with Barry Levinson previously. But he is pretty close to the top of his game here, and crucially seems to be really enjoying himself as well, which makes it incredibly enjoyable as an audience.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether perhaps part of that is simply because they're half taking the piss out of Hollywood, which obviously is, you know, in a way you might consider it biting the hand that feeds them. But I don't know whether that opportunity gives them a wee bit of license to have some fun, and that means he enjoys the role more. But
yeah,
whatever the reason, it doesn't really matter. It's that he's deeply watchable in this. These characters very, very entertaining.
I think perhaps part of what made this film so effective, I think even still today, is that kind of Hollywood link, because as news has moved from being dry, fact-based bloke in a cinema telling you this stuff to becoming slices of pop entertainment in and of themselves and being more, becoming slicker, becoming more polished, becoming more produced, it really does kind of hit home how essentially this is kind of how things are going, how media manipulation, although in this case someone is manipulating the media, but it's the media that are then manipulating the public to fall hook, line and sinker for this admittedly somewhat fanciful plot. It's not a scheme that would have survived in this age of social media. I don't know how big Albanian Twitter footprint is, but I'm sure at least one of them would have noticed, hang on, there's nothing happening here.
If this film had been made 2 years later, it would have already been painfully out of step with the times. But I think the reason for me that it works so well is that the premise of manipulating the media isn't fanciful at all, as you point out. It's day-to-day stuff. It's bread and butter stuff for the media departments of any Western government, really. But the plot of the False Invasion, etc., it's not so far out of the bounds of reality. You feel like this is some sort of near future dystopian thing going on, where it's almost believable, but it's just far enough outside the bounds of reality to push it into the necessary comic territory. Because this is for the most part to be viewed as a comedy, and I got more laughs out of this, I think, than most comedies that I've seen in recent years. But I mean, it's also to be taken incredibly seriously as well. I mean, there's a serious point to the film for all the fun and joviality that's been had. It has a fairly serious message, and actually, I think one of the things that struck me was one of the very clever things, at least from my interpretation, the way the score. Mark Knopfler produced the score for the movie, and it's a very kind of melancholic, noodly, quite simplistic background music that he's produced for the film. But that sort of melancholic tone just undercuts the comic aspect enough to remind you that actually the film's trying to say something serious. It's just using satire to make the most impact with the message that it has. So, I mean, there's sort of, as I say, for a film of which the production was so minimalistic, there's so much to enjoy here, and so much thought has clearly been put into it that I really regret not watching this sooner. But I mean, I'm glad I have now. It's, a little bit of a painful reminder of things that are happening at the moment, but enjoyable nonetheless.
Again, I think I have to appreciate that this is, as you say, it's very funny, but it is definitely a black comedy, and as far as Hollywood is concerned, it may be the blackest comedy I've seen coming from them. Certainly with what was, I believe this was New Line, so it's a fairly major studio behind it, and this amount of star power behind it. again, if you view it from today, cynicism in Hollywood movies tends not to exist, really. Certainly after 9/11, for fairly understandable reasons. But between social changes and the business case, you're probably never going to return to the kind of Vietnam-era grimness that Hollywood could give us. I can't imagine a major studio putting money behind Taxi Driver anymore. Nightcrawler may be the closest. And even that was very produced in somewhat exceptional circumstances. There's not really been anything that's dared to go so dark before. Instead, we just get lots of comic book films to distract ourselves with. So it's, I think, interesting little perhaps relic of another era where I don't think Hollywood's likely to go back to being so cynical in time.
Surprisingly sophisticated and inward looking, and as you say, very much on the cusp of the period at which things would start to swing quite heavily the other way. So there's a lot to be celebrated about it, certainly.
I saw this when it came out, actually, and watched it once in the interim, but I'd forgotten just how damn funny it is. And yeah, it is really quite black too, because not many political satires involve convicted felons who are then killed.
Yeah.
And I'd forgotten all about that bit, but then that was unexpected. I'd remembered that Woody Harrelson was a convict, okay, and that this is the person I put up. And that's one of the things that definitely wouldn't hold up in a movie set today, or if that scenario today, because people would have found out by doing Google image searches and things within about 2 seconds who he actually was. But then they take that character and have him shot by a farmer with a shotgun, basically.
If I have one criticism of the film, I think it's that in those final couple of reels it loses its way a little bit, and a lot of that stuff with Woody Harrelson's character, Old Shoe, that is pushing the boundaries a little bit. It feels like it's wandering perilously close to slapstick at a couple of points there. The bit where he's chasing after the farmer's wife feels an awful lot like a Benny Hill sketch is about to kick off. But
yeah, that's a little bit dodgy.
It's one of the few films I've seen as an aeroplane crash purely for narrative convenience.
I mean, there are a couple other bits that I wouldn't say don't sit well with me, more just they feel they've gone a wee bit too far. One isn't so much Woody Harrelson's character there, but it's the whacking of Dustin Hoffman's character. Really, a political campaign manager has that sort of pull that it gets a wee bit too far. It goes a wee bit too far at the end, I think. But,
it would have been nice to have left that hanging, actually, I think, as opposed to just explicitly invoking the narrative that he's been done away with. If anything, it might have been nice just to leave that as a threat without, you say, quite rightly put it, Drew. That does feel a little bit out of place. But I mean, that's what I mean. It's the last act maybe of the movies in general pushes things a little bit too far. But in saying that last act of the movie is still funnier than most other comedy movies. Full stop. It's nice to there's just like a couple of nice, just really wee touches that I don't think the film would have been any lesser without, but it just make you smile. I sometimes laugh. The running gag about the illegal immigrants. Yeah. And then the immigrant that had picked him up after the plane crash in his tractor, and just at the end you get this wee payoff of being made a citizen by a judge they'd roped in, just so that at no point in this narrative that they'd created would there be any illegal immigrants. No. Exactly. Can't attribute any heroism to an immigrant.
If that hadn't been in there, you probably never thought about it again, but just that attention to detail that there's a wee call back to that just as a wee coda at the end. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I think a real gem of a movie, and it's a fairly potent combination to have something which is so prescient, powerful, and at the same time genuinely funny, incredibly well acted. I
mean, it could have done without. I mean, and it's not a long film by any means, but it could have done even with 5 minutes being excised with the amount of time they spend on Willie Nelson's songwriting. Yeah. Particularly the recording of the first song that comes up, the one that gets dispatched because Craig T. Nelson's kind of undermined them. But it's, they kind of go on with that a wee bit too much because the music is terrible. Deliberately so, it's meant to be, but it's... You do it with maybe losing a couple of minutes of that, but that's really nitpicking. Otherwise, just a really, really well crafted, clever film that treats its audience with respect as well.
Yes, that's just on the Twitters as at Movie Geekcast kind of agrees, yikes, Wag the Dog, what an almost depressingly prophetic film. And well, kind of is, isn't it? Which is the worrying thing about it all.
It's definitely another case of live imitating art, as so often happens nowadays.
So I'm sure we'll circle back to it towards the end, but perhaps we can go on and talk about the other film we're covering today, In the Loop. Drew, give us a rundown on the plot there.
There's a country that's considering going to war for political gain, and there's a dossier going around and people sort of sex it up.
Seems far-fetched.
It seems far-fetched indeed, doesn't it? And then there's some spin doctors working in the background. There's some pressure from the United States, and suddenly there's a war and people die. It's a crazy, crazy thing to think of. You couldn't write that stuff, could you? Nobody'd believe it. Oh. Oh. Yes, In the Loop, coming after the fact rather than before the fact with Wag the Dog this time, is more or less based on the idea of what happened with the rush to war in Iraq and the report that eventually led to the Chilcot inquiry. And you have a bunch of diplomats and politicians nagging each other to create a reason to go to war because humans are scum.
In the Loop, of course, from Armando Iannucci, who, on a rough calculation, has been involved with 80% of all decent British comedy, that certainly anything that I've liked over the past 20-odd years. So he's directing and co-writing this. It's essentially that the halfway point between his TV shows, The Thick of It and Veep, set in Whitehall and White House, respectively. A lot of the same cast return, albeit perhaps in slightly different roles. The one person and the linchpin of the whole piece that's the same in both The Thick of It and In the Loop is the Prime Minister's Director of Communications, Malcolm Tucker, played gloriously by Peter Capaldi. And he's kind of shepherding and carpeting and haranguing Simon Foster, played by Tom Hollander, who's a Secretary of State for International Development, who appears to be kind of having a media breakdown as he kind of flip-flops between supporting and unsupporting a war almost entirely accidentally just by misspeaking in various interviews. To be fair, I kind of have some sympathy for his position because he's in conflict with the government's position that a conflict is neither unforeseeable or foreseeable, which puts in a strange little Schrodinger's box of not actually knowing what the hell this would be. So it kind of bounces about between London and Washington, as various people from the States are either sent over or we go back and meet them in the White House. People like the Secretary of State for Diplomacy, Karen Clark, Mimi Kennedy, who's trying desperately to halt the kind of march to war, along with her buddy Lieutenant General George Miller, played, I found somewhat surprisingly, but very funnily, by James Gandolfini. But it just was not a person I expected to show up in one of these kind of films where he does a hell of a job.
One of his last roles, wasn't it? Again,
must have been, yeah. And on the other side of the kind of march to war equation is the unhinged US Assistant Secretary of State for Policy, Lyndon Barrick, played by David Rash, who's also kind of wonderfully kind of detached from reality as he's going through it. He's very much of the Dick Cheney kind of creating your own reality school of thought. And
you can almost imagine Dick Cheney having a live hand grenade as a paperweight. It wouldn't feel too out of place.
And so it goes. I guess we'll maybe talk about the differences a little later, but I wouldn't want to undersell exactly how funny In the Loop is. It has the best use of language and swearing in particular that I've ever seen in a film. Continues, of course, on from his The Thick of It series, which is still highly recommended. But Malcolm Tucker is just such a tremendous character, and almost a force of nature, as the kind of foul-mouthed insultobot as he rolls through and just destroys people. And it's fun seeing watching like poor old Chris Addison, who's just perfect for being on the receiving end of one of these because he still looks like a 12-year-old boy. It's kind of funny watching him being scolded by this force of nature, Malcolm Tucker. Yeah, just really incredibly sharply written. Just some of the best dialogue in films. Still absolutely brilliant to this day. Not been topped.
Every second line's a zinger. It's possibly the most quotable film I've ever seen, just because almost every single line, you just like, I wish I could say something even half as good as that with a year's run up, I
don't think you're far wrong. It strikes a really nice balance as well, because obviously a great deal of the movie thematically deals with the minutiae of this language that is used intergovernmentally, the diplomatic terminology, and how the slightest deviation from the norm can be misconstrued as something completely heinous, such as I'm in favour of climbing the mountain of war. So for a film that took that tack, it's pretty bold. You know, it's a big gamble. You have to have a lot of faith in your writing credits to produce a film which is that heavily focused on the minutiae of the language, and actually pull it off to the degree that does that justice thematically. I mean, obviously there's a good deal is also improvised as well, but the core of the writing is absolutely I don't think I even appreciated it on first watch, actually, how sharply written it is. And rewatching it again now for the first time since it was released, I was really taken aback just by how little fat there is on it. It doesn't really stray away from the core of its theme. It would be difficult to justify excising more than about 5 frames from the whole movie. The cast are uniformly excellent, and the balance between the sophistication, or the precision of some of the language, and also just the out and out world beating flair with which Peter Capaldi invokes all of the swear words known to man with gay abandon, which I guess a lot of international audiences might not be as familiar with the thick of it. But he certainly laid down a lot of groundwork there. So I wonder how much of a shock this maybe came as to an audience who might not have been familiar with that material. But I mean, to the point where years after the fact, all Peter Capaldi was asked about in interviews when he was revealed to be the new Doctor Who is the Doctor going to be swearing then, is it? And we got weeks of Peter Capaldi sort of increasingly begrudgingly sitting on a sofa trying to look as if that was the first time he'd heard it. It is such an iconic role, and if swearing can be raised to an art form, then In the Loop is arguably the Mona Lisa of the art. So one
thing on that I really like is that you think you've reached a level with Malcolm Tucker, as we were just kind of talking about before we went on air, and you think you've kind of got a handle on it, and then they wheel out Paul Higgins's Jamie MacDonald, who's one of Malcolm's underlings, who, if anything, is even angrier, shoutier, and swearier. Yes. Just to liven it up a little bit.
Malcolm Tucker with the sophistication sieved out of him.
Then, as you say, Craig, the swearing here is an art form. It's absolute genius because it's funny and clever. It's swearing is not big and clever, well, unless it's done really well, in which case it's very, very clever. I don't want to get too bedded down on the swearing though, because it's done with such panache here. Yeah.
It's the type of, if it doesn't sound ridiculous, it's the type of language where even people who are offended by strong language would probably find it difficult to be offended by.
Very possibly, unless they're Linton Barrett. But the point I was going to make though is that don't want to get too bad in swearing, because even the non-sweary lines are fantastic.
Oh yeah.
Actually, just as a couple of examples of some of the just fantastic lines in it.
Careful, are you going to do them justice?
Oh, probably not. But
this is going to be a you had to be there moment.
Very possibly, yeah. But you have lines.
Sorry, go on. I didn't mean to pull the rug out from under you there, dude. Sorry, man.
Yes, you did. You. Climbing the mountain of conflict. You sounded like a Nazi Julie Andrews. Scott was mentioning Jamie as well. You get some fantastic lines that aren't swearing. When we were talking about before we came on air too, it was like when they're talking about the name of the informant that's in this report that they're sexing up, Iceman. You think that's his real name? Iceman. To Mr. and Mrs. Man, a son, Ice. There's just so many great lines that aren't sweary as well. It's just like not like they have this one talent of making swearing sound really good. The whole thing is so well observed, so sharply written, so cutting.
Some really great characters in here. Lots of nice characterization, especially the two of the kind of receiving end of things, I guess, for the most part. But Chris Addison and Tom Hollander himself, just doing this kind of browbeaten, awkward, shuffly type thing going on, where after some of the lines are delivered, they can just feel kind of the heat blasting from them or off them. Yeah, just some tremendous character performances, both on the sort of giving and receiving end of these tirades, and I think it does quite well in building up some pretty reasonable characters from the people that would just kind of basically just be supporting roles in a lot of things. The guys like the American interns, Chad, Zach Woods, and Anna Chlonsky's Lisa Weld, who I think went on to star in Veep it manages to have even the kind of smaller characters feel quite well rounded and quite well characterized, even though they have comparatively very few lines.
And then even too, you've got like Steve Coogan's role, who maybe in a less well written thing would have been like your typical quirky British character, slightly you might dismissed as a loon, but well, no, I mean he's a wee bit upset about what's happening, but at the same point he's not stupid. And he's
and if you're
got
British, you know someone who is that character. I think one of my favourite lines in the film is about his line about when someone invokes the notion of behaving like a suicide bomber, and he responds, "I'm hardly going to blow myself up. I'm not a suicide bomber. I'm a member of the National Trust." I didn't remember that line from the first watching, and I was sitting watching this I started watching this at 5 o'clock one morning when I had to get up with the little guy, and it must have been about quarter to 6 in the morning, and I just couldn't stop myself laughing at that line. It caught me absolutely off guard.
It's very really Middle England, isn't it?
Oh yeah, and one of the movie's great strengths, and I mean it might not necessarily be obvious to anyone, especially who's not familiar with The Thick of It, the TV series from which this movie is a spin-off, but it's worth remembering that Armando Iannucci and the producers on the film have an absolutely microscopic awareness of the ins and outs of the British political system and the way that these departments work, and rely on close sources within Whitehall for a lot of their material. So even most of these characters are analogues of real people who had previously or were still in some cases in government at the time. And it's not as fantastical as it might seem, but again, very much like Wag the Dog, it's extruded just enough to place it in the realm of comedy, while at the same time retaining more than a hint of depressing realism, I suppose.
And that's the thing.
The Chilcot report appears to to suggest this is more documentary than you would like.
Yeah, that's the thing. When the thick of it started too, people in Parliament were basically describing it as documentarian. Mm-hmm. That it was a fabrication, but these people were like, how does he know so much? This is exactly what happens here.
They weren't necessarily finding it as funny as they were creepy.
Yes.
No, fantastic resource, and crucially for obviously there's a great tradition, especially here in the UK, of taking successful TV series and creating movie spin-offs that absolutely do not work. And I suppose for something as treasured as The Thick of It, as much faith as you put in Armando Iannucci, there is in our DNA here in Britain still the fear that something like this could have ended up carry on up the Washington Monument, and that they were all going to jump on a bus and go on holiday, and that hilarity would ensue. But it absolutely is not that. It uses its increased scope and its marginally, I suppose, increased budget wisely, and it expands the characters out, but it never loses focus on what actually made The Thick of It a successful and revered series. It basically just amplifies the good parts of that, fleshes it out with more characters. Obviously, it afforded them, the increased budget afforded them the opportunity to chuck some people on a plane and take them to Washington and get talent like James Gandolfini on board, which is never a bad thing. Rest your soul, big guy. So yeah, a really impressive piece of work, and one of those films that makes you proud to be British.
Yeah, it wasn't my favourite film of 2009. It's possibly my favourite film of the decade, 2000s. Just absolutely love the film to pieces, and heartily happy to have watched it and to share it all with you.
It's a film that knows what it's doing.
So I guess we can try and look at some of the differences or comparisons between this and Wag the Dog. I mean, this will probably inevitably wind up being a discussion between the British and American political systems. Now, I think one thing that I've noticed that seems quite common in American movies, anything that's to do with the White House, I think it's most of the time it's shown as either two sides of one coin. It's either a powerful, purposeful executive that's devoted to bettering the world largely, or even when it's sort of the antagonist side of the coin and stuff like absolute power, they're still ruthless and competent and driven. Mm-hmm. You still see that in Wag the Dog, much as the kind of White House machine is doing a kind of strange thing. They're doing it very effectively, as it would turn out. Everyone's buying this, and when someone's causing bother, they vanish. So it's very ruthlessly competent. Whereas in Britain, we don't have quite the same regard for our parliamentarians, and haven't since Guy Fawkes tried to blow the place up. So when it took something like In the Loop, when it goes over to America and takes a look at the kind of White House system, it's obviously a very different picture that it paints. Mm-hmm. It's I imagine would be much closer to reality. It's a bunch of offices where people are just bumbling around doing the best they can in the current situation, and if they're lucky, that might look something like a coherent plan. But certainly it's a very different take on machinations of power. It's just a bunch of stuff that's happening, and people are just trying to deal with it as best they can. I suspect that is probably closer to reality than anything else.
Yeah, it's weird. I don't know what you mean there, Scott. With if people in office in the United States feel, at least in the way they're treated, elevated, don't they, rather than they're just more or less like you and me, but we get to go to that big building in the centre of London all the time. It's weird, isn't it? Even like if like Veep, which was Armando Iannucci's basically American take on The Thick of It, which came out of In the Loop, and it's very much like that too. It feels, yeah, I don't know what point I'm making. I'm just agreeing with you, Lars.
I'd like to know what people from outside the US and Britain think about the films in contrast, because I suppose from the UK side of things, we're probably a little bit too deep in the forest to see some of the trees. But for me, the one of the really sad things about, and more specifically in The Loop, because it deals more with the day-to-day operations throughout departments in the US, as opposed to Wag the Dog, which is very tightly focused on just certain aspects. I think the great disappointment was here in the UK, our impression broadly, I think, amongst the great swathe of the society, is that our politicians are a bunch of posh public schoolboy idiots who we expect to behave like idiots, and largely don't disappoint us in that respect. Whereas you get the impression that the American political system would be an incredibly powerful force for good if only the people involved in it weren't subverting it in terrible, terrible ways for their own gain. And I never get that impression about our system here. I always think our system here is flawed from the start. You only have to look as far as the House of Lords to understand how fundamentally screwed any political decisions made in our country are inevitably going to be anyway.
All you need to know for our country is to watch a debate in the House of Commons, where instead of recent arguments, it's basically a bunch of 5-year-olds shouting at each other. It's frankly embarrassing.
You're not far wide of the mark there. It is absolutely embarrassing. And if you have the opportunity to tune into BBC Parliament, the parliamentary channel, wherever you are in the world, please do. You'll see that Drew's not joking. But yeah, that a depressing sense of pessimism brought about by the notion that, yes, constitutionally, the American political system should be so much more a force for good than it is if only the right people were actually involved in it. But it's somehow turned into this, well, the impression we're given here is that it's almost a headless chicken running about within a very, very loose runway, loosely defined set of guides. But in contrast to the films, they obviously thematically share very strong core elements. But in terms of tone, I would suggest they're very, very different.
For all I was saying that Wag the Dog is cynical, In the Loop is much, much, much more cynical.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's what I mean. Born of that British pessimism, I think, that I was speaking about, it is harshly cynical. It's a big focused laser of cynicism. Yeah, there are more similarities than dissimilarities between the films. You have the obvious star power of Wag the Dog. De Niro and Hoffman on their own are huge banner names, even at this late stage in their careers. But to have them both on board in such a tightly scripted piece of work with such important things to say, and both operating very close to the top of their game is huge reward indeed. Whereas In the Loop doesn't have that star power to rely on. I mean, James Gandolfini is easily the biggest name in that, yep. And he doesn't have as much screen time as a lot of the other characters. But In the Loop is still nonetheless powerful, arguably a more powerful film in a great many respects, and as well written as Wag the Dog is, In the Loop is so much more tightly written than pretty much anything else.
Yes, and Wag the Dog can't come close to using something as genius as the phrase "Love Actually" as an insult about somebody's appearance.
Absolutely. I don't think there's a great deal in contrast, a huge deal of similarity. To the point where if you've already seen one of these films and enjoyed it, then I heartily recommend that you catch up with the other. You'd be doing yourself a great disservice if you didn't.
I think the thing that strikes me most about both of them, the political setup in each film feels kind of different, and the characters have different roles, so that maybe not comparable that way, but it's the cynicism. And particularly from the point of view of 2016, be able to look back, the sort of uncanny and deeply, deeply depressing veracity of it in both of them. I know, again, as I mentioned earlier, In the Loop came after the thing that it's parodying, and Wag the Dog's more just sort of a timeless thing. It's not really set on one thing that we are aware of. But both of them just seem so documentarian, as we mentioned earlier too, that they're both films that will probably leave you wanting to sob deeply.
Oh no, that's the thing of it though, is I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think the great strength of both films is that they are both easily sufficiently funny enough that I personally, I mean, as distressing as current events are from people in any number of countries around the world, I didn't feel like either of these films particularly left me wallowing in deep, depressing political introspection. They still work just as well as comedies to a degree that is guaranteed to lighten your mood more than depress it, I think, regardless of what's going on in the newspaper headlines now. I wouldn't want to put anyone off by having them think that, this is going to be so depressing to watch this. There's enough of it in the news already. They are sufficiently well written and genuinely sharply funny that I still think there is great reward to be had, regardless of your political depression at the present time or otherwise. There is no reason not to check them out. I would argue they might even work as an antidote to the current situation. But yes, I heartily recommend either film. I can't think who wouldn't like them, but I don't know. If you don't like well written comedies, then yes, look elsewhere.
Okay, so that just about wraps it up for these two films. Of course, both highly, highly recommended. Just a few shout-outs from various people, in particular people who kindly took the time out to leave us reviews on iTunes.
Those absolute sexual tyrannosaurs.
So Jeff Mack is here, left a very nice review. All these reviews, of course, very nice, but we know that he's the guy behind one of the people behind the Super PP Time podcast, which I know you're a great fan of, Craig.
One of my two new heroes.
Also shout outs to Ryan Recker, also done the Let Me Explain podcast. Kylo Ren and Stimpy, which has to be one of the best iTunes title names I've seen in some time, who does the Pod of Thrones podcast, and of course over in Australia, Chris Francis, who does the comedy Pod Socks podcast. So thanks very much to all of those for the kind words, and we just hope we can keep up to the standard of which you have become accustomed.
Yes. And to everyone who left us a Facebook like as well, you little beauties.
Indeed, thanks very much for that. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can do so, of course, on the Twitters. We're at FudsOnFilm. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/FudsOnFilm. And if you want to, of course, you could just email us at podcast@fudsonfilm.com.
Or just think Johnny Wishbone and we'll come running.
We won't do that. Don't do that if you want to get in touch with us. That won't work. So we'll be back on the 20th, where we'll just be having a general catch-up with whatever's kicking around at the cinema and some stuff on catch-up. I'm not entirely sure what that will be yet, but we'll work something in a drawer. Yes. So until the 20th, thanks very much for your attention. I will say goodbye. I have been Scott Morris, and it's also goodbye from Craig Eastman.
I didn't really steal a loaf of bread.
Andrew Tavendale.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you on the flip side. Bye.